Good afternoon from sunny Ithaca, New York. Thank you for joining us for our conversation today, A Grand Experiment, Lessons in Compliance from the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm Nicholas Phillips, and I'll be your host and moderator today. I'm joined by lawyer, compliance expert, and Professor Rich John. He also has the distinct pleasure of being a county legislator here in Tompkins County. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic affected so much of our lives, not just from a personal standpoint, but professionally as well. We all experienced what it was like to have to follow the rules handed down by our employers, state and national governments. In our conversation today, Professor John will break down how getting people to work together and follow rules takes careful thought and work, and that compliance inside businesses and organizations is essential to accomplishing just about anything. Now, before we get started, Rich and I want to learn a little bit about you. So our audience, if you could pull up this QR code here, we want to learn a little bit about our audience, like where are you joining us from? What line of work are you in? And how do you feel your employer did setting up rules surrounding COVID-19? Now scan the QR code with your phone, and that'll be our first question. So where are you joining us from? And let's see here. Let's see if we can get an idea of where. Let's see here. Perfect. So we'll be fielding your questions kind of throughout, so submit them in the chat or through the QR code, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We want to remind people that this is being recorded and will be available at the same URL immediately following our conversation. We'll be adding some additional resources in the chat as well, so keep a lookout for those. Now, some of the questions we're going to help answer for you include what goes into setting up rules for an employer standpoint, how can those making the rules get entire organizations to follow the rules, and lastly, what is a compliance circle? And again, we'll also rely on you for some of our questions as well. So it looks like we have a couple people joining us from, looks like California, Texas, Boston, Ohio, a little bit all over. Oh, Portland, Maine, perfect, my home state. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us. I appreciate it. And you brought the nice weather with you today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here talking about compliance.
Thank you so much, Rich. So let's baseline our conversation today. How did you get interested in compliance?
Well, certainly as a lawyer, I deal with rules all the time, but I was working as the general counsel at my company, at a very large commercial testing laboratory. And I was then appointed as the vice president of compliance. And so I started working in the field of compliance. And that's how I did it.
And an interesting component in our eCornell course, which you'll actually find the link to right there in the chat here, compliance systems, is the compliance circle. Now, could you break that down for us? What is a compliance circle?
Well, as I started working in compliance, I realized there's a real commonality to different rule systems, and also that rule systems have to be designed. And if you look at these as necessary elements to a functioning good rule system, you have to pay attention to each one of these elements. And we'll be talking about them in our time here today, just in general, but this is a tool I use in my course to try to explain and outline what do you mean when you say a rule system.
Mm-hmm. And how should we think about compliance systems when we're thinking about kind of how the country and businesses both handled the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, my course is, and certainly compliance generally is inside a business or an organization, and it's really focused on a very small, relatively small group of people and getting them to follow specific rules. But the pandemic was such an experiment, a grand experiment, we called it in the title, because suddenly you needed the whole country to pay attention, to follow rules, and, well, figure out what the rules are, and then follow them, and all the spill-off from there, and to do it in an incredible hurry. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really at the extreme edge of what you can consider a rule system.
Mm-hmm. And were there some major rules that kind of, flew under the radar? Obviously, we think of, the mask mandates, but were there any rules that kind of flew under the radar?
Well, I know before we started we were talking about toilet paper, and suddenly, stores had to worry about how they're selling their toilet paper. But if you recall, at the very beginning of the pandemic, the direction was go home. Mm-hmm. And suddenly businesses had to jump into action to figure out, how do we go home and continue to work? And what does remote work look like, and how does it happen, and how do you make sure people are productive? And all the rules that surround that were all secondary rules from the general direction. And we had to do them immediately, and so you think about all the difficulty of that we were working on very incomplete information. Right? We knew that there was a serious public health emergency, and we had to react to it right away. Say there was a lot of attention early on to washing your groceries, and fortunately, quickly it became apparent that it really wasn't transmitted by surfaces. But early on, that was a major consideration. There were rules put in place around what you could touch, sterilizing surfaces, that those rules went away, largely. There's still some, it's good to keep your workspaces and common areas as clean as you can, but it was mainly finally figured out that this is a respiratory threat.
I'm starting to have flashbacks of wiping down Amazon packages and
Yes.
groceries and stuff. I think a lot of our audience has got to remembering that. Now, what are your thoughts on the country implementing the mask mandate while at the same time deciding not to criminally charge people for wearing masks?
Well, again, I think that the pandemic is a really interesting example of a rule system because it's social and behavioral rules. It's not do not steal the inventory, which you might have inside a company, but really here's how we want you to behave. And there was suddenly a lot of attention to spatial awareness. What is 6 feet? How far apart can we be with each other? I remember very early on in the pandemic, I went out for a run. And I wasn't wearing a mask. I was running along a country road. There was somebody on the other side of the road yelling at me to, get a mask. They were, 40 feet away. There was so much fear. It was a very scary time. But it was also leading up to a very political dispute about what is the appropriate behavior. Trying to make that criminal would have been exceedingly difficult. And trying to enforce social norms through a criminal lens probably wouldn't have worked at all. And certainly the government's never really tried that. We had some attempt to do that, say, on enclosed spaces like airlines or airplanes. And you saw what happened, that suddenly there were these really angry disputes because of rule enforcement on a mandatory nature on people that really felt they didn't want to follow those rules. Most of what we saw with the pandemic was more peer pressure and social norms, which for what we were trying to do as a country, I think was probably the right approach.
And actually stole my next question. I was going to ask you do you think that was the right approach, not making it a criminal offense and instead of just kind of doing an honor system type thing?
Certainly, yes. If you look at other pandemics or other epidemics that we've experienced, it really shouldn't have been a surprise that it became very political. If you look at the smallpox epidemic in this country, almost exactly the same arguments were made, that there were anti-vaccine groups, there was, arguments about the science behind transmission and everything else. Trying to enforce that on a criminal level, you would have had so many, quote, criminals in the country, it would have been chaos, in my view.
Yes, I could imagine it would have been crazy. I'm thinking of people not wearing masks and things like that at first.
Yeah. And I'd add that it's also a situation where we didn't need total compliance. What we were really trying to do is not stop the spread, which was one of the messages that got out, but slow the spread, because we did not want to overwhelm our hospital capacity. And while this has been a tremendous tragedy in that we lost a lot of people, we did maintain our hospital capacity, our healthcare capacity, in large measure through the pandemic. We strained it, but by having enough people wear masks, socially distance, and follow other measures, we slowed the spread of COVID enough that we allowed the vaccines to get developed, and the treatments have gotten remarkably better. The number of people dying is much lower because of all that work. So to some extent, our rules worked. without criminalizing them. Yeah.
And I'd be interested to know if we can draw a comparison between some of the rules handed down by, our state, local, and national governments and businesses who also had to kind of adapt to the pandemic.
Right. Well, certainly I mentioned, go home, but then all the businesses that had what we call essential workers, how do they balance? You still need to come to work, but how do you do it safely? And doing it in an environment where we didn't understand the epidemic and how it was transmitted and what is safe. You needed to adapt and make new rules on a constant basis. And that makes it very difficult to try to be consistent, to be believed, because every time an organization changes its rules, there's a question, why are you doing that? I mentioned that the rules surrounding the pandemic are really at the extreme edge of rulemaking. And that was one of the elements, is that we were very stupid. We didn't know so much. And as we learned, we had to continually adapt our rules. So very hard. Yeah.
And what goes into major corporations like, say a Tesla or Apple, kind of rolling out some of these compliance systems and rules?
Well, that's essentially the core of the course. And it's nice to compare because usually businesses have far more time and they can apply resources. They're looking at a much smaller subset of people than the nation. And they can do a lot of risk management because that's essentially where rules are going to come from. Rules don't create themselves. There has to be a problem or a perceived problem that somebody says, we need some rules here to control something, to either organize or to reply or to respond to regulation or to reach some sort of goal. And businesses are constantly going through those decision-making processes to organize their activities, to make sure they're not getting in trouble with a regulator, for example, and to reach corporate goals. So say a company like Tesla, if they're dealing with large automotive batteries, well, they better make sure that they're doing quality control and they've got all the rules within their quality control system to be doing the audits the right way, to be testing the right way, to making sure they're storing the batteries the right way, that they're not damaged, before they go in a vehicle. And that's just one element. Of course, Tesla is a corporation like any other, so they're going to have labor rules, they're going to have, health and safety, they're going to have finance, to protect the money. Anywhere you see real value in a business or real risk, you're going to generally develop rule systems.
And to follow up on my last question, was there any major companies out there who you thought did a successful job or unsuccessful job implementing some of these new rules?
You mean during the pandemic?
Yes.
Certainly, you have to look at it company by company, but I would say that the healthcare industry actually did a pretty good job of developing new systems to protect their workers. There was the mask shortage at the beginning, and there was shortages of equipment like respirators early on, and they reacted in a big way, with support from throughout the country. I do remember there was a company down near Philadelphia where they basically had their workforce quarantined because they were making masks, and they locked them in and just started making masks. And yeah, there was really heroic response from different directions. And of course, there were other industries that perhaps didn't do as well, and certain parts of the country where there was real political opposition to any kind of collective behavior in response to the pandemic.
And this is a good time to tell our audience, this actually brings us to our second question. We want to know kind of what industry do you work in, whether it's the nursing field or restaurants or anything like that. So again, use the QR code on your screen here. Make sure to get that with your phone, and we'll get those responses in here as well. Now, how can compliance officers help support a company's bottom line? You had mentioned that they not only have to think about the health of their employees, but also kind of sometimes the bottom line as well. How do we draw these two comparisons here?
Yeah, always. If you're a compliance officer, you have to be very realistic that compliance doesn't generate revenue, typically. That it is a support function inside an organization. What it can do is avoid a lot of cost. If you're failing to follow rules, you can get into a lot of trouble very quickly. And you look at any business that's had a large corruption scandal. There's generally just a real breakdown in their rule systems. And the fallout from that is very, very expensive. But you don't see that until you have the problem. So compliance is always going to be one of those things where you're saying, why are we spending money there? And you have to be really, really careful how you spend money because it is a support function. So yes, you're always looking for ways to be efficient and cheap. And at the same time, if you think of a business providing a good or a service, right, there's processes that do that. Right, that if you're Tesla, you're making cars. That's your good. If you're a law firm, you're providing legal services. The rule systems that you use should be protecting the value in those processes. That you're essentially doing the work to make sure that you're not going to lose the value in your processes. So there's a difference between a process and a rule system, but rule systems work to protect the process.
And we want to thank everybody for your responses. So it looks like we do have some folks that work in compliance. It looks like we got a lot of people that work in higher education and education. And I actually want to speak to those folks out there. It seems like some of the rules that were set up for people who work in education and higher education are still in place. Is this something where we're starting to see the benefits of it? Now we can, have kids work remotely and keep schools less crowded?
I think compliance is one area where you see great adaptation. That one thing compliance has to do is it has to work. And we're all familiar with rule systems that don't work very well. Compliance has a reputation, unfairly, I think, of being bureaucratic and slow and obstructive to the core mission of a business. But I think that's because if you're doing it wrong, it's all of those things, right? But if you're really designing your rule systems, if you're careful about it, and I did see some of our people here are from the compliance field, I hope they agree with me that it is a designed function. A good rule system that's designed well, people don't necessarily even know that they're following rules. It just makes sense, and it's done in an efficient way. You can add tremendous value to a company. And I think that's one of the exciting areas of compliance that is sort of invisible, but it's there.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I did want to pull up an interesting slide of the British Prime Minister you had mentioned. I know that was one thing I definitely wanted to make sure I got to because I was very interested in that. Now, tell me what's going on here with the British PM here.
Yeah, I use this slide in my in-person class, and I thought during the pandemic, Boris Johnson was a really good communicator. He actually did a nice job. It turns out later that he was having drinks parties at Downing Street and got in some trouble for it, and he deserved to be in trouble. But I use these slides because I talk about the rule of threes. For some reason, humans respond to groups of threes, and you see it over and over again. And he was playing with communicating every time he was making a public statement. Stay home, protect the NHS, the National Health Service is the English system, save lives. And the middle one, hands, face, space. I don't know if our visitors or our guests can read that, but it's such a great breakdown of trying to convey all of the rules in 3 words, right? And to the extent you can be simple, clear, and short and use that shorthand, you're going to do a much better job of communicating. If you send people 20 pages of rules, they'll never read your rules. They just won't. And if they do, they're going to forget them. But you use all the tools you can. A good compliance officer has to be a good communicator. And hands, face, space does that. It's really clever. One of the messages I mentioned was, over and over again we saw stop the spread. And it really should have been slow the spread, but stop the spread has a very definite, sort of heroic character to it. And so that was what was used. But there's lots and lots of psychology going on if you're working really hard to do that training piece, that element in the compliance circle, to get your message across and to use every opportunity to do it. And that's Boris Johnson. So we'll visit with England for a little bit.
That sounds good. I think our friends from across the pond would appreciate that as well. One of the things you mentioned was, the rule of three, it seems like clear and concise can kind of stick in our minds. How important is it to have one, clear and concise rules, but also, like you mentioned, not have 20 pages of rules and regulations, but maybe just a couple?
Yeah, again, for our guests that are compliance officers, I hope you'll agree that nobody is going to read your rules for pleasure. They just won't. And they won't read your rules unless they really need to. And so you want to make those as simple, clear, and short, and accessible as you possibly can. And there's, again, psychology there that if you can get in and get inside people's heads quickly and in a straightforward way, you have a much better chance of imprinting your rules and having them recalled later when people need them. So yeah, you should be doing a lot of work on that element of break it down, break it down, break it down. Yeah.
And I do have a follow-up question for you, but I want to get to one question from our viewer, Michael, who asks, I don't see how the rules do or did comply with informed consent HHS 45 CFR 46. Your thoughts, please.
I have no idea what HHS 45S is, I'm sad to say. But sure, there were major breakdowns, right? The country was in a crisis and in an emergency. They made mistakes, the government and businesses made mistakes all the time because they were trying to do this. They were building the airplane while it was flying. I admit, with all that said, if the goal was to preserve our hospital capacity, our medical system could not break down, those rules helped that happen.
Building the airplane while it's flying. I'll have to keep that one on the back burner. So my follow-up question was, how do we get the maximum amount of employees to follow some of these compliance rules that are set forth?
Well, we're going to look at a slide in a minute, I think, on the commitment spectrum. Going back to the last question, informed consent. If people understand the rules, understand the reasons behind the rules, you're going to have a far better chance of having them follow them. Nobody likes to follow rules that they don't realize, why do we need these rules? And that's a key part of the training element as well, is explaining that narrative, right? And trying to get informed consent, to get that buy-in. This, again, is a slide I use in the eCornell course and in my class, my in-person class, that whenever you're designing a rule system, you really should figure out how far up the spectrum do you want to push your audience. That is it just barely compliant, right? If your rules aren't critically important, say, you have a break room, you have a refrigerator, and people are not, taking their old food out. You set up some rules in the company, get your crap out of the refrigerator. But who cares, right? Are you going to devote real resources? If you are a bank and you've got the SEC watching you, and you need to make sure that you do not have improper, disclosure of information, whatever, you're going to have, and that's core to who you are, right? As a financial institution, you need to push your audience farther up. You need to get them up to, say, invested or maybe enthusiastic if it's truly core to your business. Well, what that means is a much greater investment of compliance time, compliance budget, right? Money, effort, the training, the reminders, everything else has to be built into your system if you truly need to be there. But you have to make that decision as part of your design. If you don't have to get up to that very top of the spectrum, don't go there, right? That you want to reserve that for really what's essential to your company.
So should you, depending on your industry, really figure out which kind of note you should be on? Is that
Oh, yes.
actually how it is?
Yeah, and I think that's an area where a compliance officer inside an organization can add real value, is trying to distill and figure out what is core, what is our mission, what is essential. And that goes back to the risk management function at the very beginning of creating a rule system. You have to figure, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we protecting? Where's the value? And moving from there to, all right, this is really valuable. We better do extra. Yeah.
And I want to remind the audience again, keep those questions coming. We'll be fielding those throughout and kind of getting those answered as we go along. I do have one question from Lori. She asked, the information coming out from the CDC, the WHO, and the New York State Department of Health was saying different things about masking, sanitizing personal space, that it was impossible to follow everyone's rules. I believe this played a part in the confusion and division between people. How can this be prevented?
I think that's exactly right. And that was a function of having different organizations trying to respond to the evolving information about the pandemic as quickly as they could, but not in coordination. And so we did have messaging that was like, who do we follow? Where should we be getting our trusted information? And in a lot of senses, that ended up breaking down across the country and creating political division, which is unfortunate. And again, that's why I think that's a useful comparison for compliance to inside businesses, that it was just too hard as a country to get a unified message. But inside a business, inside an organization, you should be able to get that, right? And you have to work very hard that the message is not just simple, clear, and short, but consistent, right? And well thought out. And within the compliance circle, it fits the other elements.
And given your experience in this, how long should a company spend on crafting their compliance systems or crafting their rules?
It depends on the rule. Say, if you compare it to the federal government rulemaking process for regulations, that can go on for years. There's all these receipt of information and consideration and hearings. Inside a company, it's going to go much quicker because you have a CEO who says, come on, get it done. And that's good. But in terms of time, once you create your rules, then if you look at the compliance circle, most of the time is spent in the policing stage, because that's when you're actually operating your rule system, right? That sure, you figure out, we need rules, you write them, you train on them, you launch them, but policing is the biggest wedge. This isn't a true pizza, or it's a pizza with unfair slices. That you don't use investigation and enforcement unless you detect a problem. But you have to have that capacity. You got to have investigative capacity and true ability to enforce. Assessment should be going on a continual basis. And in fact, the policing function is designed around trying to determine, it's encouraging people to follow the rules, sending them reminders, but also determining, are they following the rules? And there should be metrics and measurement devices built in. And that's going on every day, and that's the biggest wedge. But policing and the other elements will also feed into assessment. So you're always saying, can we make these rules better? To borrow from quality systems, you have this idea of continual improvement. You should always be looking at your rule system to say, it might work better, this way or that way. And in fact, the pandemic, they were doing assessment and changing their rules all the time, which, it was, suddenly, right at the beginning, it was, okay, you don't need to wear masks. For a week or so, they said, no, you need masks. And then it was cloth masks, then it was, no KN95 masks. And, now you don't need masks in this environment, but in that one you do. The constant change is really hard, but that was the product of continual assessment and trying to figure out, what do we need right now? And there's problems with that, as the question we just had, that you confuse people. But you should be always looking at your rule system and tweaking it to figure out how do we get a little bit better. And perhaps maybe we don't need the rules anymore.
And we do have a lot of compliance folks in our audience. is the constant changing, is that something that's normal? The kind of constant changing and tweaking of some of these rules.
No, no. It shouldn't be. And certainly for most companies, most of their rule systems are very similar to rules in other companies. So you have lots and lots of places to go to get standard rules, and then you figure out, how do we apply them within our organization? You're going to see a lot of difference in, say, the enforcement element. How do we punish somebody who broke our rules? And there's a lot of business-specific approaches to that. What are you trying to do? Do you want to give people a lot of second chances? Do you want to set examples? There you're going to see a lot of variation. But most of the rule systems are going to be fairly consistent with other companies.
And we actually just got another question in from a viewer here, from Chris. He asked, when it comes to messaging about compliance and optics, how do people tend to respond depending on the source or order of compliance, say a CEO versus a compliance officer versus HR?
That is a really good question, because a compliance officer has to have authority. That if you're looking at the compliance circle, it's not going to work if people say, I don't have to do that. And often people will do that. They will challenge the rules, right? They're down at the end of this commitment spectrum where they're resistant or just refuse. And there are times where a compliance officer has to stand up and say, no, we're going to follow these rules, and we're going to, investigate a violation, and we're going to do something about it. If the compliance officer does not have the support of the CEO, that becomes incredibly hard, because you're going to see challenges come at you as a compliance officer that you need that backing. You need to be able to walk into an office and have ready to go, uh-oh, I better cooperate, and you'll see that play out in lots of different ways if there's a CEO that doesn't feel compliance is an essential element. And you see cascading problems as a result of that.
And I actually was going to ask you about that. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the compliance officer and, say, the CEO? Should there be kind of that symbiotic relationship there where it's the compliance officer can feel empowered to maybe hand down some rules?
Absolutely. You need that support, and if there's any CEOs out there, and I can talk to you, what I think is critically important is the CEO recognizes the value to an organization of a good compliance function, that you're going to be protecting value in the business, you're going to allow far more cooperative, organized behavior. And if you look at businesses, that's what they are, right? If you have a bunch of, if I can use the term, cowboys doing whatever they feel like, you're going to have problems, right? And any business or organization, that's what it's about. It's people working together. And compliance is essential to making sure that happens efficiently and effectively. So yeah, you need a CEO that sees that value and will then support compliance as this support function that sits next to whatever the business is doing, making its good or service, to make sure that people are doing it the right way. Yeah.
And how do we maximize the amount of folks that follow the rules? I'm thinking, again, about maybe the mask mandate or, getting the vaccine, and, 100% would be great, but how do we get the maximum amount of employees to kind of follow the rules?
Yeah, one, you want to have that support from the top, the tone from the top. But again, it goes back to what we were talking about, simple, clear, and short. You want people to understand the rules, so you're communicating them in a very clear way, and then you want to imprint them. And that's a key part of the training element, that you're engaging people, not just to understand the rules, but to employ some cognitive load. You want them to think about your rules, and you challenge them. You can do that, say, by question and answer. Like if a compliance officer just gets up and just says, here's the rules, I'm going to read them, right? People may understand what you're saying, but it just goes by because they didn't bite into them. And you want to be doing things to force people to think about the rules, to talk about the rules perhaps, write something about the rules, if they're core, right? If you need to push them up the continuum, this commitment spectrum, you want to get the people to work with it in their brain on a focus level. We talk about system 1 and system 2, that the system 2 type of thinking being the really engaged, effort. And you want them to make some effort. And what that will do is they understand the rules, they engage some cognitive load, that will help imprint, and it's going to help them with recall. It will also help them with buying into some investment. That if they're thinking about them and they're thinking about them in the context of the purpose or goal, why do we have these rules? That will help later on, hopefully. But you're going to have some people who break your rules, no matter what. Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know, is tone important in that messaging? Is it, more important to come across as maybe firm and heavy-handed, or is it more important to come, across as lackadaisical? Is tone important?
Absolutely. And you have to decide, and I think that the training element is where you can be very creative, and it's a fun part of compliance, I believe. But you want to use, Aristotle talked about the 3 elements of persuasion, logos, pathos, ethos, that ethos is your presence, your demeanor, that your authority, that you are there as the compliance officer, and you need to project that you're able to tell people what to do, and you have to have that on some level. Pathos is emotional and story-based, and people react to stories. So you want to say, if you're talking about health and safety, if you start talking about Bill who got hurt and how avoidable that was and the consequences of it, you're setting an emotional tone that helps imprint. And then logos, you want to use rational, logical arguments to say, we're at this level of worker injuries. 22% is unacceptable. And if we do these steps, if we follow these rules, we're going to drive that number down to a level that everybody goes home safely at the end of the day. That's a logical, numbers-based approach. Well, when you're putting a training together, you're always looking for, how do I get there? How do I reach that? And as I said, it's one of the more fun, creative parts of compliance. And you don't think of compliance. I know it has this stodgy reputation, but it's really critical that you engage your audience and you figure out how to do that.
I'm thinking about those 3 symbols that Boris Johnson had up at his press conference. For whatever reason, I just can't get that out of my mind. It's very easy to remember.
Yeah. Hands, face, space. Hands, face, space.
Very, very easy. So that actually brings us to our third question that we want to ask the audience. Again, we'll pull up a QR code where you can answer this last question. We want to know how you feel about how your employer did as far as setting up some of those rules and regulations during the pandemic. So hopefully we'll get some ratings here from about 1 to 5. 5 obviously being excellent, 1 being could have used a little word. So hopefully we'll get some answers. And I just actually got a question in from Dylan. So Dylan asks, compliance is often a behind-the-scenes function. I think it's often misunderstood, which doesn't help the compliance folks or the employees at the organization. What's a good way to help employees understand more about the compliance function and recommendations?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Compliance will never be the starring role. And it shouldn't be, right? Because a business is set up to do something. It's good or service. And the productive capacity of the business, that's the star. But compliance helps. It's an important supporting role in the show. I think that if compliance is visible, that they're out in the company, and they should know the company well, right? That you can't really do compliance if you're not intimately familiar with what do we do? What is our organization about? What is our mission? And talking to the people in the organization about it. If compliance shows up when there's a crisis, when there's a scandal or some need to investigate, that's a little late. Compliance should be out there advertising on a regular basis. And people may not even know that it's really the compliance function there. Because I use the term broadly, say a compliance officer can be an HR officer or a health and safety officer. They might have a different title, but they should be out there making themselves known in the business and engaging people with that rule system that they're responsible for.
Mm-hmm. It seems like we got a lot of people who said they actually rated their company did really well. That's that's good. That's actually really good to hear. And I want to know, what's the best way for compliance officers to get their messaging across? You would mention that not a good time would be when something happens.
Yes. Yeah.
So what would be the best time for maybe a compliance officer to make themselves known or get that messaging across?
Well, it's like that saying, when's the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 20 years ago. But the next best time is now. You get out there and you do the best you can. Compliance departments typically have fairly limited resources. They usually don't have all the head count that they would like. So you do the best you can in the organization, but you want to take every opportunity you can to wave the flag, and early, yeah.
And is it worth companies investing a lot in maybe some compliance officers?
It depends on the business. Obviously I'm biased, absolutely. But if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have to deal with regulatory approval from the FDA, or an investment bank where the SEC is, they can stop your business, if they find you're not doing something right and it's core to your mission. Yeah, you need compliance officers. And say in the pharmaceutical line, compliance is a huge function, right? You need to make sure that the medicine you're making is being made the right way, that you can document it, that you can prove that it's made the right way, and that all of those rule systems are supporting allowing the business to do that. In other companies where, they're providing some good or service that isn't so heavily regulated, you may not see the title of compliance officer, but you're still going to have rule systems that are going to be essential. It might be under somebody else's title, as I said, like health and safety.
And we actually just got an interesting question from a viewer. They ask, do compliance officers ever highlight the effectiveness of past compliance measures with historical data, concrete results of past initiatives using database decision-making reporting, or actually making the case for compliance by providing its effectiveness with facts? Thinking about Tompkins County, where we saw only 50 deaths versus 250 average nationally, and I know you can speak to this.
Yeah, certainly. Well, going local, I think we can be pretty proud of our health department here in Tompkins County. They really took a force-forward approach. They were very communicative and worked really hard to address this, why are we doing it? And to synthesize all the conflicting information coming from the state, from the CDC, from other sources, and saying, here is, why we're saying you should do this. And the other part of the question?
The other part of the question was thinking about...
data-driven, yes. Yeah, and I mentioned that in terms of training, that if you can use rational, logical arguments to say, here's why, that is going to help with certain types of audiences that really react to that. And again, you need to gauge your audience. Is an emotional appeal? Is it... You do it, sort of an authoritative approach, going to work. But if you're designing your system properly on that compliance circle, if you think about the policing function, you should have metrics in place that are measuring whether your rule system is working and the impacts of the rules. If you have those metrics, that works into a feedback loop that you can use that information to say, this is why we need these rules. We're doing really well here. We do not want to let that drop off. And of course, one of the casualties of our human condition is we forget. So you do want to have a whole system of reminders for a core rule system to go back to it and say, hey, keep it up, and here's how we're doing. Here's our scorecard, and yeah, here's where we're failing. We need to do better.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
shout out to Health Director Frank Krupa. He did a really good job. I know he might not be watching, but he did a really good job here in Tompkins County.
He barely slept, I think, for 2 years. Yeah.
Yes, I remember interviewing him a few times, and he looked like he was a little tired. looked a little tired. And how important is it, like you mentioned, that humans just by nature can be somewhat forgetful when we're using past examples and things like that. How important is it to bring in past examples that are memorable, something that can stick with somebody?
Sure. Again, that goes to how our brains work. In that, if you want memory, you need to present the information. It has to be encoded. It has to go in, and then it has to be encoded in such a way that it'll be recalled later. And memories fade, or they were never imprinted very well to begin with. So the better job you can do as a compliance officer with getting inside people's heads, and you want to use all those tools of Aristotle shared with us, to convince people and to make them think about it, to create cognitive load and all the neural pathways that our brains use to process memory, you're going to have a better chance bringing it out later. As I said, stories are a great way to do that. That we imprint stories. They're a pattern. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we connect with them because we're people.
True. And how can compliance systems protect the values of an organization?
Well, if they're working properly, they will do that, right? If you've designed your rules to do it. If you have crappy, stupid rules, maybe they won't. But if you've really designed your system that these rules address the risks that we're worried about, and you then go all the way around the compliance circle, that you don't stop, you don't leave out one of the elements. Say, you really don't have investigative capacity. And when I use that term, I'm meaning, well, you don't really know how to do an investigation, or you don't have the time to do it, or you don't have budget, or you don't have the cooperation of the departmental managers for you to come in, or the CEO doesn't care. You're going to lose that element, and your rule system will break down there. If you're not policing, it'll break down at that point. But you want to go all the way around the circle and say, we have a consistent approach to a design system, and that'll protect the value.
And we had mentioned your course earlier in the conversation, but I want to bring it up just real quick a little bit again. What can folks expect taking the course or expect to learn?
Well, they're going to walk around the compliance circle. That's what they're going to do, and that's what they can expect. That it's looking at each one of those elements and trying to see how one connects to the other, and to imprint this idea of design it. Design it, and think about how each one of those elements is working or isn't, when you have it in operation.
And for some of our compliance folks out there who may be thinking about drafting some new rules or some new compliance systems, what do you think is the first step in maybe crafting a new rule, or what would be that starting point?
I think you get it down on paper, but then you need to make sure it's tied back to the purpose or the goal, the essential reason why you think you need the rules. If they don't connect, if your rules don't really address that issue, you're not going to get anywhere. So, or you will get somewhere, but it's not where you want to go, I guess. I think it's vital that it goes back to that first step, that first element. Why are these rules important? And if you can't state that, if you can't get it right in your own mind, you're not going to convince anybody else.
Perfect. So write it down. First step for some of our compliance folks out there. We just got another question from one of our viewers. They ask, is incentivizing better than policing punitive approaches to compliance, maybe alternative approaches?
It depends. It depends on the rule system and the determination of the compliance officer. This is going to work in this instance. A good example of that, say, is sexual harassment training, where there's been an approach that, and again, I don't want to light a firestorm here, but a lot of times where it's really sort of, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. The people who you're really trying to reach, upper level management who have big egos and don't like to have their authority questioned, don't really react to that very well. And studies have shown it doesn't work the way you want it to. While there's other approaches that say, sort of be a hero. We need to stand up. We need to be strong. We need to protect all our employees. Maybe that's not the right approach either. I'm not taking a position on it, but it's interesting that you want to tailor how you're doing it to the most effective way of getting your message across and getting the conduct that you're really looking for.
And, how do we know how to, tailor that? Is that just, kind of learning a little bit more about our employees or, figuring out who this rule is specifically for? How do we kind of tailor that?
Well, this is part of the reason that, say, I think the reputation, the bureaucratic, dull reputation of compliance is really wrong. That if you're doing it right, you're thinking about the human condition. Who are we as people? How do we function? And you incorporate a lot of psychology, a lot of brain science, certainly organizational behavior, and you design your rule system, you sculpt it accordingly, that you want to get to the most effective system you can, but you have to bring in a lot of expertise from a lot of different directions. And I think that's part of the reason I think the course kind of works.
And how can understanding, maybe the psychology of some of our employees and saying, some might follow this rule, others might not, how can understanding maybe the psychology help us better implement some of these rules?
Well, you take the tool for the job and trying to figure out, again, what is going to be effective with the particular audience. You really want to identify who you're talking to, and try to make some educated guesses about what are they going to react to. You don't, if you're talking to, say, teenagers, you're going to have a very different approach than if you're talking to, retirees. The type of language you're using, the attention span, the stories that you use, they should be relevant. They should mean something to the audience you're addressing. It becomes more difficult if you're in a business environment where you're talking to a broad spectrum that may look like people you went to high school with, right? That there's highly educated, middle educated, and people who didn't finish high school. And, language skills are all different. You need to make sure your message reaches the people you need to reach. Maybe you don't get everybody, but you want to get as many as you can and get to them effectively.
And something I just thought about is, has compliance systems changed over the years? Have they developed, say, maybe in the 80s and 90s compared to now? I'm thinking about, the workforce and, how maybe different generations understand compliance differently. Have you seen compliance systems maybe change over the decades?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's some things that haven't changed at all, which is that if you want to organize behavior, you need rule systems. You need to make sure people are working together in a rational, efficient, polite way. But we're also working through globalization, where we're seeing far more complexity, right, and far more data, that our ability to collect information has just exploded. And this is good and bad, right? There's way more things to keep track of, but businesses are able to move much faster and to make far more informed decisions. Well, that affects compliance as well, that there's way more ways, say in the policing element of the compliance circle, for a company to determine, are people following the rules, right? You have way more metrics, sometimes too many, right? You have to be judicious about how much time a compliance officer can devote to looking at all the information streams. But the information streams are there, and I think they're only going to grow. That we're not going to see less complexity. I think we're going to see more, and we're going to see more information. It will allow compliance to be far more nuanced, to be far more directed to individual elements within an organization, and to hopefully detect problems far sooner.
And you mentioned, globalization and a lot of companies being more global now. Does that change how we develop compliance systems when we have, maybe some folks here in the U.S. compared to China, compared to the Middle East, compared to Europe, to Africa? Does that change when we, have globalization?
Yes, it makes compliance far more difficult. If we were able to, it would be much easier to do business just local, right? Where you can drive across town, you can visit with your customer, you speak the same language, you're in the same time zone, your culture is the same, and it's all homogenous. That's not where we live, and it's not where we're going. I think it's, you add all of the issues of distance, language, culture, time, and communication methods that are, disconnected at times. It's going to be much harder, but the potential benefits are so obvious and so great that we're not going back, which means that compliance needs to manage far more complex systems or deal with far more complex systems, and so it's going to have to grow and continue to, but it's becoming more essential as a result that you have way more opportunities for chaos inside a business or an organization.
And how important is it for compliance officers to maybe ask other compliance officers or get maybe some of their employers' feedback regarding crafting some of these rules?
Yeah, that should be built into the assessment function, that a compliance officer should have their ears wide open, right? That they should be mining that information stream on their rule system or streams all the time, right? If people hate your rules, you're going to hear about it. And, you then have to think really hard about, well, why is that? And it should drive the design to something that's less hated. Sometimes you have to say, those are the rules. You just have to do it. You can't hit people at work that you don't like, But again, if you've designed a rule system that has, a 3.5-page application form to get an approval, people are going to hate you, and they're going to blame you, and they're going to fight with you about it. And so you need to constantly be saying, how can compliance support the central functions of the business in an efficient way? How do we get it down to a half a page or 1 page and make it simple to fill out and to process, so we're not slowing the business down and we're not angering people.
Perfect. And one quick note for our audience, we're almost done, but we just want to hear from you, just kind of hear how we did. So we'll pull up a QR code for you one last time where you can respond to how we did. Now, before you leave us, Rich, I want to know, what's one note you could leave maybe some of our compliance officers or, anybody on this call? What's one thing you would want them to know as they kind of walk away and go back to work?
Well, I hope that they took away from this that there's rule systems that are good. We all have examples of rule systems where we go, who did this, right? Why? But those really jump out at you, and they give the compliance function its reputation as being bureaucratic and slow and obstructive and everything else. But there are well-designed rule systems that really do work. They, somebody did think about them, they do own them, and they're running them the right way, and you don't even know it, right? And that's true compliance, and that's where compliance can add tremendous value, and protect value inside an organization.
Well, thank you so much, Rich. And again, if you want to take this course, we'll drop that link in there one more time so you can take that certificate compliance systems. Again, Professor John, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for your questions, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Nicholas.